The naval base in Virginia was alive that morning, humming with the nervous energy of waiting families and the stiff precision of military tradition. The parade ground, freshly painted and lined with flags, stretched wide under the crisp autumn sky. A brass band warmed up in the corner, their notes bright but uneven as they tuned instruments in preparation. Beyond the chain-link fence, cars were lined for half a mile, proof that no one wanted to miss this moment. The SEALs were finally home. For weeks, the community had been buzzing with anticipation. Deployment was always hard, but this one, nearly a year in length, had been brutal. Whispers of battles fought, operations gone wrong, and dangerous missions spread through the families who waited for letters that never came. When the announcement came that the unit was returning, the entire town seemed to breathe for the first time in months. Mothers baked cookies, children drew crayon-colored banners, and wives and husbands rehearsed tearful embraces in their minds. Everyone wanted the day to be perfect. The reviewing stands overflowed with proud parents and spouses, dressed in their best, flags clutched tightly in their hands. Children climbed onto shoulders, their tiny fists wrapped around red, white, and blue pinwheels. Cameras hung around necks, ready to capture the moment of reunion. The air was thick with perfume, hairspray, and nervous laughter. A cheer erupted when the first sight of uniforms appeared in the distance. But amid the colors and noise, one figure stood apart. Near the back of the crowd, just past the folding chairs reserved for officers' families, stood a woman who seemed oddly out of place. She wasn't cheering, clapping, or waving a flag. Her hands remained buried in the deep pockets of a dark green jacket, her posture still and controlled. She wasn't dressed for ceremony. Her jeans were plain, her boots scuffed, her hair tied, back in a no-nonsense braid. She might have been mistaken for a passerby, or perhaps a volunteer who had wandered too close, but she wasn't either. She was simply watching. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, stayed fixed on the formation marching in. While others craned their necks to catch glimpses of familiar faces, her gaze moved like a spotlight, scanning every man with the precision of a soldier. Yet, when she finally settled her focus, she didn't smile. She didn't cry. She only stared with an intensity that, if anyone had noticed, might have unsettled them. But almost no one did. People were too consumed with their own happiness to wonder about the quiet woman who kept her distance. To them, she was invisible, a shadow, at the edge of the celebration. Only one man would notice her that day, and the way her silence carried more weight than any cheer. Commander Richard Hayes stood at the front of the formation, his chest decorated with medals that reflected the morning sun. He was a man hardened by decades of service, with eyes that had seen too much and carried it all in silence. His men trusted him implicitly, and his community revered him as a hero. Yet Hayes was not the type to bask in adoration. Even now, as cheers rose around him, his mind was elsewhere, scanning the crowd with the same instinct that had kept him alive in war zones across the globe. Years of combat had trained him to notice details others ignored: the twitch of a hand near a weapon, the unnatural stillness of a shadow in the brush, the faint sound of footsteps behind a wall. Today, those instincts should have been resting. He was home, safe, surrounded by families. Yet something prickled at the back of his mind, urging him to look closer. His eyes swept across the sea of faces: smiling wives, sobbing mothers, children, bouncing with joy. Then he saw her. At first, she blended in like anyone else. But the longer he stared, the more she pulled into focus. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't moving. She wasn't even pretending to join in the celebration. She was only watching and watching him. For a moment, Hayes felt a flicker of déjà vu, like seeing the shadow of a ghost from a past mission. His steps faltered ever so slightly, though no one around him noticed. He looked away quickly, trying to shake it off. Perhaps she was just someone's relative, nervous or reserved, unused to the pageantry of military ceremonies. That would explain it. That had to explain it. And yet something in his gut told him otherwise. He glanced back once more, expecting her to have turned her gaze elsewhere, but she hadn't. Her eyes met his with an unsettling steadiness. It wasn't admiration or gratitude or even curiosity. It was recognition. Hayes blinked, his heartbeat quickening. He knew that look. He'd seen it before, not here, not in Virginia, but somewhere far from home, in a place where lives balanced on the edge of a knife. Around him, the ceremony pressed on. The band struck up the anthem. Families clutched each other tighter, and officers barked orders to keep the formation sharp. Hayes moved automatically, his body obeying the motions of protocol, while his mind locked on the silent woman at the back. He told himself not to get distracted, but the harder he tried to ignore her, the stronger the feeling grew. Who was she? And why, in the middle of the happiest day in months, did she feel like a shadow of something long buried? The woman shifted slightly, enough to adjust her jacket as a gust of wind swept across the parade ground. For a fraction of a second, the sleeve slipped up, and Hayes caught a glimpse of something on her arm. It was faint, partially hidden, but unmistakable. His stomach dropped. He couldn't see the whole design yet, but the flash of ink was enough to make him freeze. He knew that mark. He had seen it once before, years ago, in the middle of a mission no one was supposed to survive. A mission that had been erased from official records. A mission that haunted him still. The band crescendoed, the crowd cheered, and the men around him smiled, basking in the glory of their homecoming. But Commander Hayes barely heard any of it. His mind was already racing, torn between the ceremony in front of him and the shadow of the past that had just resurfaced in the form of a quiet woman standing at the back of the crowd. And she was watching, always watching, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment all along. The ceremony unfolded like clockwork. The brass band swelled with patriotic fervor, polished notes rolling across the parade ground, as if to drown out the months of silence endured by those who had waited. Children squealed and darted between rows of folding chairs. Banners fluttered in the cold breeze. Every corner of the base was alive with emotion, laughter, and relief. But she remained still. The woman in the green jacket did not clap when the band finished its number. She did not rise when the announcer's voice called the men heroes. She did not cry when children rushed the field to cling to their fathers. Her presence seemed to exist in direct opposition to the celebration, an island of calm in a storm. Of noise, no one noticed at first. The human eye is trained to follow energy, to find smiles and motion in a crowd. The laughing wife with her bouquet, a toddler waving a miniature flag, the veteran saluting with trembling hands, these drew the gaze. Not the woman who stood still as stone, her hands buried in her pockets, her lips pressed in a line so faint it could have been mistaken for indifference. Yet if one had looked closer, they would have seen that her stillness was not apathy. It was control. Every muscle, every breath, every flicker of her eyes was measured. She was not lost. She was not distracted. She was watching with the precision of a hawk. Her gaze moved across the formation of seals, scanning face after face with subtle calculation. For a second, her eyes lingered on one man, then passed on. She wasn't searching for a husband, or a brother, or a son. She was confirming something else entirely. And once she had confirmed it, her attention anchored firmly on Commander Hayes. He could feel it. Hayes had spent a career navigating the thin edge between life and death. In every city where danger lurked, he learned to sense when he was being watched. The stares of curious civilians, the glares of enemies behind shuttered windows, the fleeting glance of a spotter signaling a sniper's position. He could feel all of it. That sense had saved him more than once, when split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home and being shipped back in silence. And now, in this supposed place of safety, that same sense was gnawing at him. He shifted his weight slightly, disguising the movement as nothing more than a ceremonial adjustment. His eyes swept the stands again. The families were exactly as they should be: joyful, overwhelmed, some weeping openly into each other's shoulders. But there, near the back, she hadn't moved an inch. Stillness, silence, watching. Something about it unnerved him. Hayes knew the look of pride, of longing, of relief. He also knew the look of someone with unfinished business. The woman's eyes told him she wasn't here for a reunion. She was here for him. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. He turned his head back toward the line of officers standing beside him, careful not to betray the distraction. Admiral Leary, broad-shouldered and smiling, was giving his remarks to the crowd, praising the unit for their valor, their professionalism, their unyielding spirit. Words Hayes had heard 1,000 times. Words that, on any other day, he would have stood behind without question. But today, his mind kept drifting. Who was she? The woman had shifted slightly, her shoulders angling as if to avoid brushing against the family seated closest to her. A mother with 2 young boys sat to her left, completely unaware of the stranger's presence. The boys clutched small flags and whispered loudly to each other about which soldier was their dad. One of them glanced up at the silent woman once, curious at her lack of enthusiasm. She offered no smile in return, no nod of acknowledgement. The boy quickly lost interest, tugging his mother's sleeve instead. It was as though she wanted to remain invisible. And yet Hayes couldn't look away. He tried to reason with himself. Perhaps she was a widow, someone who had lost a husband to war and found it too painful to cheer for the survivors. Perhaps she was a sister of a man who had not returned, punishing herself by bearing witness to the joy of others. Or maybe she was simply a local who had wandered too close to the spectacle, a passerby carried along by curiosity. But none of those explanations fit. Her eyes betrayed her. Widows carried grief in their gaze, a heaviness that bent their shoulders and dimmed their expressions. This woman's eyes carried something sharper, not grief, not despair. Something active, like a knife honed to perfection. And if there was one thing Hayes trusted more than anything, it was his instinct for knives in the dark. The ceremony pressed forward. Names were read, honors bestowed, applause thundered at every interval. The band struck up a march, brass echoing into the blue Virginia sky. The men stood proud, their discipline unwavering, even as children rushed forward, slipping through the lines to wrap small arms around their father's knees. Cameras flashed like gunfire. Through it all, she remained rooted in place. She didn't record the moment on her phone. She didn't dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. She didn't even sway with the rhythm of the anthem. She simply stood, eyes trained on Hayes, waiting. And in that waiting, Hayes felt something heavy pressing against him. Memory, the faintest flicker of a night he'd buried deep. A night of fire and chaos, when survival had seemed impossible. He shoved it back down, unwilling to let the past intrude on this day. But the woman's stare had a way of pulling the memory up again, like a tide dragging wreckage to the surface. Hayes clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the admiral's speech. He could feel sweat collecting under his collar, despite the cool air. Around him, his men remained sharp and professional, blissfully unaware that their commander's focus was being pulled apart by a silent figure in the crowd. Then the wind shifted. It was nothing, just a gust sweeping in from the coast, scattering leaves across the pavement, tugging at flags. But in that gust, the woman's jacket sleeve lifted just slightly, enough to reveal a sliver of faded ink on her forearm. Hayes's breath caught in his throat. A tattoo, not the kind worn for fashion or sentiment. This was different, angular, precise, marked with symbols that were never meant for public display. He couldn't see it fully, but he didn't need to. He'd seen it once before, long ago, in the darkest chapter of his service. The world seemed to narrow in that instant. The Admiral's voice became distant, the applause muffled, the band's triumphant notes little more than noise. Hayes's vision tunneled, locking on that fragment of ink like a sniper sighting a target. It wasn't possible, and yet there it was. The woman, for the first time, shifted her gaze. Their eyes met across the distance. Not by accident, not by chance. Recognition. It lasted only a second, maybe two, but it was enough to send a chill down Hayes's spine. Then, as if nothing had happened, she lowered her sleeve again. Her expression never changed. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge his frozen reaction. She simply returned to her stillness, as though daring him to believe what he'd just seen. Hayes's pulse hammered in his ears. His instincts screamed at him to act, to move, to confront, but he couldn't. Not here, not now. The ceremony demanded discipline, demanded composure. His men depended on him to lead by example. So he swallowed it down, locking the moment away, his body rigid in parade posture, even as his mind reeled. The ceremony continued, oblivious. But Hayes knew one truth with absolute certainty. The silent woman wasn't here by accident, and her presence meant the past he thought buried was clawing its way back to the surface. Commander Richard Hayes had learned to master the art of focus. In the chaos of war, his gaze had always been his greatest weapon, clear, unshaken, calculating. A single glance could tell him whether a door was booby-trapped, whether a man's nervous twitch meant fear or deception, whether the stillness in the jungle was nature or an ambush waiting to strike. His men relied on that ability. Hayes could see danger where others saw nothing at all. And today, at what should have been the safest place on earth, his glance betrayed him. From his position at the head of the formation, Hayes allowed his eyes to drift, just for a second, back toward the stands. He told himself it was harmless. Commanders were expected to acknowledge their men's families, to nod respectfully at parents who had given their sons to the service. It was protocol, normal, but that wasn't why he was looking. His gaze cut across the faces, past the cheering families, past the fluttering banners and raised cameras, until it landed on her again, the silent woman in the green jacket. She hadn't moved, not even an inch. Her posture was as rigid as his own, her focus unrelenting. If she had been standing on the parade ground with them, she might have passed for a soldier at attention. And it was that stillness, that discipline, that set her apart from everyone else. Hayes felt the heat rise beneath his collar. His chest was steady, his posture perfect, but inside, his instincts were clawing at him. The tattoo, that damned flash of ink he'd seen moments ago. He tried to push it aside, to convince himself it had been a trick of the light. He had only seen part of it. Maybe it wasn't what he thought. Maybe he was chasing ghosts. But then she shifted her weight again, and Hayes caught a second glimpse clearer this time. It was no mistake. The design was unmistakable. Years ago, in a desert that no map dared to name, Hayes had seen that very same emblem, worn not as a badge of pride, but as a mark of secrecy. It wasn't the kind of tattoo sailors got in port after a drunken night. It wasn't ink meant for fashion or rebellion. It was a code, etched into the skin of those who lived in shadows. His pulse quickened. Why here? Why now? And why her? Hayes forced his eyes forward again, snapping them back to the Admiral, as though nothing were wrong. His jaw clenched, the only outward sign of his unease. Around him, his men stood steady, their discipline flawless. None of them had noticed his faltering attention. But one man did notice. Lieutenant Brooks, his second in command, shifted his eyes toward Hayes with the faintest flicker of curiosity. Brooks was sharp, always watching, always analyzing. He'd spent enough time under Hayes's command to know when something was off. And Hayes, for all his control, wasn't immune to being read. "Something wrong, sir?" Brooks whispered under his breath, so soft only Hayes could hear. Hayes didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked forward, his lips barely moving. Nothing. Eyes front. Brooks obeyed, but the glance lingered. Hayes could feel the question, hanging in the air between them. He ignored it, forcing his mind back to the present. The Admiral droned on, listing operations completed, lives saved, missions accomplished. The crowd roared with pride at every mention of victory. Hayes heard the words, but they blurred together, dulled by the steady thrum of his heartbeat in England. His ears. He risked another glance. The woman was still watching him. Not the men, not the Admiral, not the ceremony. Just him. It was no accident. Hayes felt the past pressing in, memories he had locked away clawing at the edges of his mind. Nights spent in hostile territory, when every sound carried the threat of death. A mission that had gone so catastrophically wrong, it had been buried. By the brass, scrubbed from the records. A kind of mission no one was supposed to remember. And yet, standing in front of him was living proof that someone did. The crowd erupted in applause again, pulling Hayes briefly back into the present. A line of children rushed onto the field, carrying a banner with the words "Welcome Home, Heroes," painted in crooked letters. The men behind Hayes broke their stoic discipline, grinning at their children, nodding proudly at their families. It was the kind of moment soldiers fought for, the simple joy of being home, of being seen as more than weapons. But Hayes couldn't share in it. His eyes darted back to the stands. The woman hadn't joined the applause. She hadn't even smiled at the children's display. Her gaze remained fixed, unbroken. And for the first time, Hayes noticed something else. Recognition. It wasn't just that she was watching him. It was how she was watching him, like she knew him. Like she remembered him from somewhere he wished he could forget. The thought made his stomach twist. He didn't know her. He was certain of that. If they had met, he would have remembered. Hayes never forgot a face, not after decades of needing to distinguish ally from enemy in seconds. And yet, something in the shape of her eyes, the calm precision of her stance, sparked a familiarity that unsettled him. Perhaps it wasn't her face he recognized, but what she represented. Shadows, secrets, survival, and that tattoo. The wind carried the sound of the band again, swelling into another patriotic march. Families cheered, waving flags high above their heads. Hayes forced himself to smile faintly, just enough for the crowd to see. Cameras snapped, capturing the image of a commander, proud and unshaken. But behind that smile, his mind was racing. If she was who he thought she was, if she was connected to that night, then her presence here meant something. No one from that mission should have survived, least of all her. The reports had been clear. She was gone. And yet she stood there, flesh and blood, daring him to acknowledge her. Hayes felt a surge of anger, though he couldn't quite place its target. Anger at her for resurfacing now. Anger at himself for being rattled. Anger at the world for refusing to let the past stay buried. Another glance. Another confirmation. She tilted her head slightly, the barest acknowledgement of his stare. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't even challenge. It was confirmation. Yes, you remember. Hayes's chest tightened. The Admiral's voice rang out, signaling the end of his speech. The crowd rose to its feet, clapping, cheering, shouting words of gratitude. The band thundered again. The men around Hayes relaxed, smiles spreading across their faces. Brooks leaned slightly closer, murmuring something about the Admiral's praise, but Hayes barely heard him. Because in that moment, Hayes understood one thing with chilling clarity. The silent woman in the green jacket hadn't come here to celebrate. She had come for him. And his life, the life he had built on discipline, command, and carefully guarded secrets, was about to unravel. The ceremony moved with the precision of a machine, but inside Commander Richard Hayes's chest, there was chaos. The applause around him thundered, echoing across the naval base as the band launched into another triumphant march. The Admiral raised his hands, gesturing proudly to the formation of returning SEALs. Families shouted names. Children waved flags so furiously they nearly lost their grips. It was a scene of joy, of celebration, of relief. But Hayes wasn't celebrating. His eyes kept sliding back again and again to the figure at the back of the stands. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't shifted her weight, hadn't clapped her hands once. She was still, patient, a fixed shadow among a sea of noise. She was waiting for something. And Hayes knew, with the instinct that had carried him through decades of war, that whatever she was waiting for involved him. Then it happened. A gust of wind, sharper this time, whipped across the parade ground. Flags snapped against their poles. The corner of the banner carried by the children flapped wildly, nearly slipping from their grip. Hats tumbled into the air, chased by laughing kids. And the woman's jacket sleeve pulled back again. Hayes's eyes locked onto it like a predator. Spotting prey. This time, there was no mistaking it. The tattoo was fully visible, etched deep into the skin of her forearm. Faded from age, but unmistakable in design. A sharp triangular emblem, interwoven with a serpent, encircled by a single ring broken at one point. The mark of the Phantom unit. Hayes's breath stilled, his vision tunneled. He knew that mark. Years ago, in a desert operation that had been classified before it even ended, Hayes had seen it. Not many had. Fewer still had survived to tell the story. The Phantom unit wasn't officially recognized. Even its existence was denied by the Pentagon. They weren't SEALs, Marines, or CIA operatives. They were something else entirely, assets who operated in shadows, where legality and morality blurred. Ghosts. He had only encountered them once. It had been in the middle of a mission gone horribly wrong, his team ambushed, pinned down in hostile territory, cut off from extraction. Hayes had been certain none of them would live through the night. But then she appeared, not alone, never alone, but leading them through the chaos with ruthless precision. She moved like a phantom, guiding them through ambushes, striking at the enemy with knowledge no civilian could have had. Her team had pulled his men from the jaws of death. And then, just as suddenly, they had vanished. No names, no acknowledgments, no records, only the tattoo remained in his memory. That strange emblem glimpsed in the dark, on her arm, when she turned to shield one of his men from gunfire. The same tattoo staring back at him now, in broad daylight, at a homecoming ceremony. Hayes's chest tightened, his jaw locked. It wasn't possible. She wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Officially, the Phantom unit had never existed. And unofficially, the whispers said they had all been killed years ago. The kind of deaths no one mourned, because no one was supposed to know they had lived. Yet here she was, alive, watching him. Hayes's fingers twitched at his side, the only betrayal of the storm inside him. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to confront her, to demand answers. But protocol held him in place. He was still in formation, still the commander, still being watched by hundreds of eyes that saw him only as a war hero returning home. He couldn't break. Not here, not now. But his mind. His mind was already unraveling. The memory hit him. Like a blow, sand whipping across his face. The night sky burning with tracer fire. His men shouting, scrambling for cover behind half-destroyed walls. The sound of mortar ripping the ground apart. He remembered thinking, "This is it, we're done." And then her voice, calm, precise, cutting through the chaos with authority. No one questioned. "Left flank now, move." He hadn't recognized her face then, only the certainty in her tone. The kind of certainty that made soldiers obey without hesitation. They moved, and somehow, impossibly, they survived. And later, when he caught a glimpse of her in the dark, gunfire lighting the tattoo on her arm, he had locked it into his memory. Because Hayes never forgot the details that saved lives. Now, standing under the sun in Virginia, he realized he hadn't been wrong. She was real. She had been there. And now she was here. Watching, waiting. Why? The applause rose again, jolting him back to the present. Hayes blinked, forcing himself to breathe. His chest ached from holding his composure. Around him, his men shifted, finally allowed to break formation as families surged forward. Wives rushed into arms. Children leapt into embraces. Laughter mixed with tears. The air was thick with relief, but Hayes didn't move. Brooks glanced at him again. "Sir?" Hayes forced his jaw to unclench. "Stand fast." Brooks hesitated, then nodded. But Hayes knew the younger officer was watching him closely now. He'd noticed the distraction, even if he didn't understand it. Hayes's eyes flicked back toward the stands. The woman hadn't joined the rush of families. She hadn't risen to greet anyone. She simply stood, her sleeve now openly revealing. The tattoo as though she wanted him to see it, to acknowledge it. Their eyes met again. This time, it wasn't fleeting. It was deliberate. She tilted her chin ever so slightly, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing. But Hayes understood it for what it was. Confirmation. Yes, she was who he thought she was. Yes, she remembered. Yes, she wanted him to know she was here. Hayes's stomach twisted. 1,000 questions clawed at him, but none louder than the one that haunted him most. Why now? The mission was long over. The files had been buried, the men sworn to silence. The phantom unit was gone at least. They were supposed to be. Her survival wasn't just improbable, it was dangerous. If she had resurfaced, if someone had allowed her to, it meant the secrets Hayes had spent years keeping might not stay buried. And in the world Hayes lived in, secrets didn't stay buried without a reason. The band struck up once more, pulling the ceremony toward its close. The Admiral clasped Hayes's hand, smiling for the cameras, praising him as a symbol of American resolve. Hayes smiled back, the mask of command firmly in place. But his mind was nowhere near the stage. It was locked on the woman in the crowd, on the tattoo, on the truth he had tried, desperately, to forget. And for the first time in years, Commander Richard Hayes felt the chill of fear, not from enemies on foreign soil, but from a ghost standing quietly at the edge of his homecoming. The roar of applause still thundered in Richard Hayes's ears, but it was distant now, muffled beneath the pounding of memory. He stood at attention, jaw tight, his face frozen in the stoic mask of command, but inside, he was no longer in Virginia. He was back in the desert. The night returned to him in fragments, jagged shards of memory he had tried to bury beneath duty and silence. Heat, fire, the stench of smoke clinging to his gear. His men scrambling for cover in the ruins of a bombed-out village. The sound of gunfire so constant it blended into a single roar, punctuated by screams. They had been ambushed. It was supposed to be a routine extraction, a clean sweep through the edge of hostile territory, in and out, before dawn. But intelligence had been wrong. The enemy had known they were coming. The kill zone had been prepared with ruthless efficiency. Hayes could still see the moment his unit walked into it. The first explosion had thrown Corporal Lenny James nearly 10 feet into the sand, blood streaking down his temple. Sergeant Macklin's cums were fried instantly, the antenna bent into useless metal. Hayes himself had been slammed into a crumbling wall, ears ringing, vision blurred. And then the shadows had erupted. Gunfire rained down from rooftops, cutting off their escape. Mortar rounds pounded the ground, shaking the earth beneath them. Bullets ripped through the air, splintering stone, shredding the thin protection of ruined walls. They had been surrounded. Hayes remembered the crushing realization that they weren't going to make it out. His men, good men, were going to die in that desert. Then she appeared, not alone. She had a team with her, moving through the chaos. Like smoke, but it was her voice that Hayes remembered most. Calm, commanding, unflinching. Left flank now. Cover the wounded. Move. It hadn't been a suggestion. It had been an order, sharp enough to cut through the noise, precise enough that even men, trained never to take commands from outsiders, obeyed without hesitation. And when they moved, she was already ahead of them. Hayes could still see the flash of her silhouette against the burning night, the way she darted across open ground without fear. Her rifle spoke in short, exact bursts, each shot finding its mark. She wasn't just fighting, she was orchestrating, shaping the battlefield like a conductor with a symphony of chaos. The rest of her team moved with the same ruthless efficiency. Silent hand signals, coordinated strikes, perfectly timed demolitions at open paths where none should have existed. But she was the one who anchored it all. The tattoo had glistened when her sleeve rolled up, catching the dim light of tracer. Rounds, that strange emblem triangle, serpent, broken circle etched into her skin like a secret oath. Hayes had locked it into his memory, even as he fought to keep his men alive. And then, the night only grew darker. The firefight raged. For hours. Hayes's men dwindled, some wounded beyond saving. The enemy pressed hard, relentless, confident in their numbers. Every second was a gamble, every breath a miracle. But the Phantom unit held them together. She had dragged Private Torres out of the dirt with her own hands, covering him with her body as bullets slammed into the wall behind them. She had thrown herself into the line of fire to detonate charges that collapsed a building on top of advancing hostiles. She had barked orders with such precision that Hayes's men forgot she wasn't one of them. And then, just before dawn, they vanished. The last thing Hayes remembered was standing on the edge of the extraction zone, bleeding, exhausted, half his unit barely alive, and watching as she gave a final order to her own team. A nod, a gesture. Then they melted into the desert, swallowed by the rising sun. No names, no explanations, no acknowledgement, only ghosts. When the dust settled, the official report was written. It told of a hard fight, a narrow escape, and the bravery of Hayes's unit. No mention of the Phantom unit, no mention of her. He had tried once to bring it up to his superior. The admiral at the time had shut him down instantly. You didn't see anyone. Do you understand me, Commander? But sir, you didn't see anyone. File your report. That's an order. And so, the truth had been buried. Hayes had never spoken of it again. Not to his men, not to his superiors, not even to himself. He locked it away, convinced it was safer forgotten. Until today, until the ceremony, until she stood there, alive, watching him with the same calm intensity as she had that night. The applause jolted Hayes back into the present, though the desert lingered in the back of his mind like smoke that refused to clear. He blinked, finding himself once again under the autumn sky of Virginia, the parade ground alive with joy. But The weight in his chest told him the desert wasn't done with him yet. The tattoo, that damn tattoo, it wasn't just a mark. It was a secret, carved into her flesh, binding her to a world that wasn't supposed to exist. And now it was binding him again, dragging him back into shadows he had sworn to leave behind. Why was she here? Why now? Had she come to remind him? To warn him? To threaten him? Possibilities churned in his mind, each darker than the last. Hayes's eyes flicked toward her again. Their gazes locked across the distance. For the first time, he noticed something in her expression. Not indifference, not arrogance, but something quieter. Recognition. She knew he remembered. And beneath that recognition, something else flickered. A weight, a burden, perhaps even the same silence he carried, a past unspoken. Hayes clenched his fists at his sides, forcing his posture to remain perfect for the watching crowd. But inside, he felt the cracks spreading. The secrets he had buried were no longer safe. And the woman with the tattoo, the ghost from the desert, was the one who had brought them back to life. The ceremony was winding down. Families were embracing, laughter mingling with tears, children clutching medals and flags. Cameras flashed, immortalizing joy. To the hundreds gathered, it was a perfect scene. Heroes home at last, a nation proud. Sacrifices honored. But for Commander Richard Hayes, it was anything but perfect. The storm inside him only grew louder. Every cheer, every handshake, every salute seemed to fade beneath the weight of her presence. That woman at the edge of the crowd, silent, steady, her tattoo now plainly visible, had unraveled years of carefully buried silence in the span of minutes. He had fought wars, buried men, led missions few could imagine, but nothing had unsettled him like the calm way she looked at him. She knew, and now he knew she knew. Hayes's throat was dry. He forced himself to return a mother's hug, to ruffle the hair of a boy who handed him a crayon drawing, to accept the Admiral's praise with practiced humility. But his eyes kept drifting. Back to her. Always back to her. And finally, the moment came. Their eyes met once more, not in passing, not by accident, but locked deliberately, as if the entire crowd had melted away between them. The world around. Hayes blurred. The laughter, the band, the cameras, it all fell silent. There was only her. And in that gaze, Hayes read everything. Recognition, confirmation, a message unspoken. Yes, you remember, and I remember you. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't warmth either. It was acknowledgement. The bond of two people who had walked through fire and survived, bound not by choice, but by circumstance. Then she moved. Not much, just a tilt of her chin, the barest inclination of her head. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. But to Hayes, it was as loud as a shout, a signal, a greeting, or perhaps a summons. Hayes's chest tightened. His instincts screamed that this wasn't random. She hadn't just wandered into the ceremony. She was here for him. And suddenly, Hayes realized something that chilled him deeper than the memory of gunfire. If she was alive, if she had resurfaced, then someone had allowed it. And if she was here, then the past wasn't finished with him. Sir? The voice snapped him back to reality. Hayes blinked, forcing his mask back into place. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Brooks, was standing. Beside him, eyes narrowed. You good, Commander? Brooks asked quietly, keeping his tone low so the others wouldn't hear. Hayes adjusted his shoulders, forcing authority back into his voice. I'm fine. Brooks studied him, unconvinced. Hayes could see it, the sharp mind of a younger officer, one who paid attention, one who noticed when his commanding officer faltered. And Hayes had faltered. You've been distracted, Brooks pressed, lowering his voice even further. Since the beginning of the ceremony. You keep looking into the stands? Something wrong? Hayes forced his gaze away from the woman. Nothing wrong. Keep focus. But Brooks didn't drop it. He followed Hayes's earlier line of sight, scanning the crowd. Hayes tensed, fighting the urge to stop him, but that would have drawn even more suspicion. And then Brooks's eyes caught her. For a moment, his expression was unreadable. He looked back to Hayes, then back at her. You know her? Brooks asked. The question was simple, but it cut deep. Hayes's jaw locked. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Brooks frowned. He wasn't a fool. He had seen the subtle signals between them. He had seen the way Hayes's composure cracked, the way the woman hadn't joined the joyous chaos around her, the way she stood out without trying. She's been watching you the whole time, Brooks said carefully. Why? Hayes forced himself to breathe evenly. Drop it, Lieutenant. Brooks hesitated, then nodded slowly. But his eyes lingered on Hayes, sharp with suspicion. Hayes hated it. Brooks was loyal, competent, and smart, the kind of officer who would rise far. But loyalty also came with curiosity, and curiosity could be dangerous. The less Brooks knew, the safer he would be. For both of them. Hayes looked back toward the crowd, his chest tightening when he saw the woman was still there, still waiting. She hadn't moved, hadn't broken her gaze, even as family surged around her. A child nearly collided with her, chasing a balloon. But she stepped aside, without losing focus. A veteran stopped nearby to shake someone's hand, blocking her from Hayes's view for a moment. But when the crowd shifted, she was there, again still locked on him. It was deliberate, calculated, and Hayes knew then that this wasn't just a coincidence or a ghost resurfacing. This was an opening move. Whatever game had begun in that desert years ago was starting again, right here, in front of everyone. And she wanted him to know it. The Admiral's voice rang out once more, calling for one last round of applause. Hayes clapped when expected, smiled when the cameras flashed, accepted the embrace of another family with the warmth of a man who had just led heroes home. But inside, his mind was elsewhere. On the woman, on the tattoo, on the silence they both carried. Recognition had passed between them. And with it, a door had opened that Hayes had sworn would never be touched again. The past was no longer unspoken. It was standing in the crowd, waiting for him. The final notes of the military band drifted across the parade ground like the dying embers of a fire. Families were beginning to gather their belongings, laughter echoing as children chased one another across the grass. The Admiral shook hands. One last time, then retreated with his aides, his polished shoes clicking against the asphalt. The ceremony was officially over. For everyone else, it was the conclusion of a celebration. For Commander Richard Hayes, it was the beginning of something else entirely. He stood among his men, smiling when expected, returning salutes, murmuring words of reassurance to families who needed them. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, but his mind was far from the field before him. He couldn't stop. Scanning the crowd, she was still there. At the edge, where the line of trees began, she hadn't moved much since the ceremony started. The families passed around her like water around stone, but she remained fixed, a figure carved from calm resolve. Her eyes hadn't left him, not once. And now, as the crowd began to thin, her stillness grew more unnerving. Was she waiting for him? Or testing him? Hayes forced himself to finish a conversation with Sergeant Macklin's wife, who gripped his hand with tear-streaked gratitude. He nodded, offered words of comfort, and excused himself gently. Then he looked again. This time she was moving. Not hurriedly, not suspiciously, just walking, as if she were one of the many visitors drifting back toward the parking lot. But Hayes knew better. He had seen her move before, in another place, another life. Every step was calculated. Every glance over her shoulder was measured. She was leaving. And if he let her go, he might never see her again. "Sir?" Hayes turned sharply. Brooks was at his side again, his expression sharp, too sharp for comfort. "You're leaving?" Brooks asked. Hayes blinked, realizing his body had already shifted, his boots angled toward the edge of the field, toward her. He cursed himself silently for the slip. "Just stretching my legs," Hayes said flatly. Brooks frowned. His eyes flicked toward where the woman had been, and Hayes felt the chill. "He sees her too." "She's leaving," Brooks said quietly. Hayes's jaw tightened. "And?" Brooks hesitated, then leaned closer. "And you're watching her." "Sir, I've been with you long. Enough to know when something's off." "Who is she?" Hayes forced his face into stone. "That's not your concern." "With respect, Commander," Brooks pressed, his voice low but steady. "You don't lose focus in the middle of a ceremony. Not unless it's serious. If she's a threat." "She's not a threat," Hayes snapped, sharper than he intended. Brooks stiffened. Hayes closed his eyes briefly, forcing his voice back into control. "She's not a threat," he repeated, calmer this time. "Drop it, Lieutenant." Brooks's lips pressed into a thin line. He gave a short nod, but his eyes remained searching, filled with questions Hayes refused to answer. Hayes turned away before Brooks could push further. The woman was nearly gone now, her figure blending into the slow stream of families heading for the lot. Decision clawed at him. He could let her leave. Pretend none of this had happened. Pretend the phantom unit remained buried. Pretend he hadn't seen the tattoo, hadn't remembered that night, hadn't felt recognition pass between them like a silent oath. Or he could follow. But to follow meant stepping into shadows again. To follow meant unraveling everything. He had built his career, his reputation, the carefully guarded silence of years. Hayes's heart pounded. And then, without realizing, his boots carried him forward. He moved through the thinning crowd with a commander's grace, nodding politely when greeted, but his focus was elsewhere. Each step was a risk, each step a choice. He saw her pause near the far edge of the lot, her back to him now. She didn't look hurried, but she didn't linger either. Hayes knew the rhythm of a disappearing act when he saw one. She wasn't just walking away. She was slipping out of reach. Hayes quickened his pace. "Commander? Brooks again?" His voice came from behind, sharp with suspicion. "Where are you going?" Hayes ignored him. He had no choice. The distance closed. 30 feet, 20, 15. The woman paused again, as if sensing him. She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see the profile of her face. The same calm, unreadable expression. The same eyes that had watched him across the battlefield of memory. Recognition flared again, silent, heavy. Then she moved. Not away, but sideways, slipping between two parked vehicles. Hayes followed. His breath was steady, but his pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't duty. This was instinct, raw and uncheckable. He turned the corner. The lot was half full, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows between rows of cars. But she was there, only a dozen paces ahead, walking with the same calm certainty. Hayes opened his mouth. He almost called out. Almost said her name, though. He didn't even know it. Almost demanded answers, though he wasn't sure he could handle them. And then she stopped. Dead still. She turned fully this time, facing him across the narrow aisle of cars. No crowd now, no distractions, just the two of them. For the first time, Hayes saw her clearly. The years hadn't dulled her presence. If anything, they had sharpened it. Lines of experience etched faintly at the corners of her eyes. Shoulders squared with unshakable confidence. That tattoo, bold and undeniable, marking her as something more than a soldier, something beyond. Neither spoke. The silence was heavier than words. Recognition had become confrontation. Hayes's breath caught. He felt the world narrowing to this single moment. The unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back. The air between them was heavy, thick with years of silence. Commander Richard Hayes stood rooted in place, staring at the woman who had haunted his memory, the ghost who now stood alive and tangible before him. Her eyes held his, steady, unblinking. Then, for the first time, she spoke. "You remember." Her voice was calm, low, carrying no accusation, only certainty. Hayes's breath caught. The sound of her voice unlocked something inside him, as if hearing it confirmed beyond doubt that she was real. That night, that mission, hadn't been a fever dream born from trauma. "I remember," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Her expression softened, just barely. "Good. For a long time, I wondered if anyone did." The words cut him deeper than gunfire ever had, because they were true. For years, he had locked away the memory, convinced himself it was better that way, easier, safer. But now, face to face with her, the lie burned. "What's her name?" Hayes asked. She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing whether he deserved the answer. Then she said, "Elena Marquez." The name struck him like a forgotten chord, half familiar, half strange. He repeated it quietly, as though anchoring it into reality. "Elena." She nodded once. Silence stretched again, but it was no longer empty. It thrummed with unspoken history, shared danger, the impossible survival of a night meant to erase them both. Hayes took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel of the lot. "Why now?" he asked. "After all these years? Why show yourself?" Elena's eyes flicked past him briefly, scanning the lot, the shadows, the lingering stragglers. Old habits. Then she returned her gaze to his. "Because I don't have a choice anymore," she said. Hayes's jaw tightened. "Explain," she exhaled slowly. "I stayed silent. I disappeared like they wanted. I built a life under another name, in another city. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. Someone came looking." Hayes felt his chest tighten. "Who?" Elena's eyes darkened. "Not just one person. An agency. I don't know which. Maybe the same people who buried us. Maybe others who finally realized the truth never really went away." Hayes's instincts flared hot. "What do they want from you?" "The same thing they always wanted," Elena said bitterly. Silence, erasure, to finish what they started in that desert. The weight of her words pressed down on Hayes. He glanced over his shoulder instinctively, half expecting Brooks or another officer to appear. The lot suddenly felt too open, too exposed. "You shouldn't have come here," Hayes said, his voice low but urgent. "This isn't safe. Not for you, not for anyone." Elena's lips curved, not quite into a smile, more like an acknowledgement of irony. "Safe? Commander, you and I both know safety was never an option." He clenched his fists. "Then why? Why here? Why now? Why me?" "Because," she said firmly, "you were there. You saw. You know the truth, even if you've tried to. Bury it. And if they're coming for me again, they'll come for you too. We're tied together, whether you like it or not." Hayes's pulse hammered. She was right. As much as he had tried to deny it, their fates were bound. Phantom Unit wasn't just a memory. It was a secret alive and dangerous, clawing its way back into the present. He swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" Her gaze softened just a fraction. "I don't want anything from you, Richard. Not really. I just need you to remember. To admit it. To stop pretending it never happened." Hayes's throat tightened. For years, he had carried medals, citations, praise all built on silence. The truth would unravel everything. "You're asking me to destroy everything," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to face what's already destroying you," Elena countered. The words hit like a strike. Hayes faltered, his mask slipping. She saw the truth in his eyes before he could hide it again. The sleepless nights, the flashes of memory, the weight he carried alone. "Elena?" He paused, struggling. "If they know you're alive, if they know we've spoken, then they'll come," she finished for him. Her voice was steady, almost resigned. "They always do." Hayes stared at her. The parking lot buzzed faintly with distant voices, but here, between the cars, it felt like a different world. "What's your plan?" he asked finally. Her gaze was sharp, unwavering. "I don't have one, not yet. But I know I can't fight this alone, and neither can you." Hayes's chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. He had led men into impossible battles. He had stared down death and walked away. But this was different. This was a war fought in silence, in shadows, where loyalty was a weapon and truth was a target. "You're putting me in a corner," he said. Elena's expression softened. Again, a flicker of something almost human beneath the steel. "No, Richard, I'm giving you a choice. Maybe the last real one either of us will get." The weight of her words hung heavy. Hayes felt the pull of duty on one side, the pull of truth on the other. Career, reputation, silence versus honor, memory, and the debt he owed the woman who had saved his men. Before he could respond, movement caught his eye. Brooks, the young lieutenant, stood at the edge of the lot, half hidden behind a vehicle, watching. Hayes' stomach dropped. Elena saw him too. For the first time, her calm cracked, tension flickering across her features. "He's yours?" she asked. Hayes' voice was tight. "My second." "He doesn't know." Brooks took a step closer, suspicion written all over his face. He had followed. He had seen enough to know something was wrong. Hayes turned back to Elena, but she was already moving. "Wait," she shook her head. "Not here. Not now. You'll see me again." Elena, but she was already slipping away, her movements precise, efficient, vanishing between rows of cars with the same practiced ease she had shown years ago in the desert. Within seconds, she was gone. Hayes stood frozen, the air sharp. "In his lungs, Commander?" Brooks's voice cut through the silence. He approached cautiously, eyes darting toward the direction Elena had disappeared. "Who was that?" Brooks demanded. Hayes forced his face into control, but inside he felt the unraveling in full force. The truth had found him again. And this time there was no burying it. He looked at Brooks, searching for words that wouldn't come. "Finally," he said quietly, "someone I should have remembered sooner." And with that, Hayes knew nothing would ever be the same.